standing between you and your lunch? Am I the last speaker, Simon? Oh, there's more. Okay, all right. Well, my name's Nisha Sajnani, and I'm a professor at NYU down the street. I chair our Creative Arts Therapies Consortium. I direct our graduate program in drama therapy. I'm a Canadian-American. I moved here in 2007. I come from a family of refugees. My parents had been refugees in Agra during the partition of India and Pakistan, which seems some time ago, but I'll tell you that my mom was a poet, but she couldn't really practice her poetry, although maybe it came out in the sabji, and maybe it came out in the roti, and maybe it came out in the way that she raised me. But she had enough support and enough resource to be able to create a family in Canada, which is where I was raised. And of course, like so many who live through those kinds of histories, I carry that kind of concern with place and displacement as part of my epigenetic inheritance, and it shows up in a lot of the work that I do. So now, in addition to teaching at NYU, I also co-direct and co-founded a lab called the Jameel Arts and Health Lab. It was formed with the World Health Organization to measurably improve lives through the arts, to advance research in that area, to translate that research into a public awareness campaign, and to ultimately shift policy in terms of creating a conducive environment where the arts can be mobilized to support various kinds of physical, mental, and civic health concerns. So it's a little bit of a flip, because we're thinking now about artists who are displaced. And when we think about people who are displaced, the 123 million that the UNHCR has reported to date, we don't often have metrics on the intersections of identity, because of course they're grandmothers and they're mothers and they are doctors and they're lawyers, and we don't really have a good tracking system around how many are artists. Although in listening to you this morning, or for at least the last 4 or 5, maybe those metrics do exist, and I'd love to know about that, because there are certain coalitions that I'm just hearing about today that I think already speak to some of what I'm going to address. So I'm speaking about mental health and defending mental health, which is often thought about in a very individualistic fashion. It's thought about from a pathological point of view. It's often thought about as an individual pursuit in connection with highly trained specialists. That may not be how you're thinking about it, and I would say if that's the case, you're in a smaller bracket if you're thinking about it in the collective, if you're thinking about it from a salutogenic or a health promoting kind of perspective. So my specialism, and in terms of my training, I trained in theater artist. I got really concerned and interested in what was happening backstage as well as front stage, all of that solidarity building, ensemble building, community building, the sense of connection that could happen through the kinds of exercises that we were using. That led me to train in drama therapy, and ultimately I continued to work with people who were newcomers, and then specialized in trauma and anxiety-related conditions, and then led the community health clinic at or rather the community health program at the Post-Traumatic Stress Center, which is a specialist center in New Haven. One of the ways that we think about trauma there is as an event or a series of events that lead to an experience or that are accompanied with an experience, typically one of fear and typically one of being overwhelmed, having one's usual coping strategies overwhelmed, that you're not able to draw on the same resources, or perhaps that capacity is somewhat delayed. And that shows up, or rather can be manifested, in a change in the way you think about yourself or think about the world. When we think, and furthermore, will show up in behavior. So event, experience, beliefs, and behavior. And typically, in a managed care mental health clinic, it's the behavior that will land somebody in a higher level of care. It's the behavior, the hostility, the disruption, the distress that will create a reaction that might land somebody in a care scenario, although care I'll put in brackets because there are different kinds of care, and I see some nods around that. Now that trajectory can be really useful in the sense that we do need to attend to the events. In fact, the trauma-informed movement that started to spread throughout the US since Anda and Felitti published this I think a very useful paper. It's a paper that came out of Kaiser Permanente in 1998, and then it just went sort of silent. Nobody really talked about it until maybe 2008, 2009, it started to gain some traction. And it was a study that they called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Has anyone heard of that? 3, 4 people have heard of that. All right, so this way of thinking, the way that they got to it was they started to notice that the 60,000, 70,000 adults that they were seeing in their care centers who were struggling with chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, other kinds of non-communicable diseases, all seem to be able to endorse at least 3 or 4 adverse situations, adverse childhood experiences, adverse adult experiences, although their attention was more on childhood experiences at the time. So, you know, this raised some questions. Listen, if we're able to attend to those experiences, could we prevent the kind of sequelae of symptoms that start to land people in a higher bracket of care? And ultimately, this kind of agenda, this kind of rhetoric gets motivated from an economic perspective because you can ultimately lower care costs. I would say that's a mixed agenda because there are some entities that are very interested in keeping those costs high. So it just depends how you use it and how you mobilize it, right? But it shifted the question to what's the matter with you to what happened. What happened, right? What is the event, the precipitating event or series of events? And attention on the experience, still really useful because, as our colleague who was speaking about self-defense spoke about, sometimes one's somatic system is so activated, the thing you have control over, an agency over, might be, hopefully, still your breath to regulate the system. Somatic approaches, right? In terms of the beliefs that one starts to internalize about themselves and the world, this is where, from a traditional mental health perspective, you might use strategies like cognitive behavioral therapy. What kinds of thoughts do I have about myself and the world? And how might those thoughts be shifted? Again, I'm just speaking about a traditional line of mental health care, and then we'll flip it a bit. And then if we look at behaviors, we can start to work with folks on an individual level or within a group to look at how those behaviors may be linked to these events and understand them more as reasonable responses given the kinds of experiences that they've had, the somatic experience that's showing up inside of them, the beliefs that they carry. We can understand how a set of behaviors might begin to make sense. However, that doesn't necessarily, fix the issue altogether. I'm gonna come back to that trajectory in just a moment, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the mental health needs of people who are displaced. And again, I've actually heard remnants of this already spoken about in this room, so I apologize for some of the repetition. All right, if I can just find that particular spot, skipping ahead from things that have already been mentioned. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the adverse experience as an event. Of course, we know that this is not usually a singular event. It's often accompanied by a cascade, that people go through any number of challenging experiences. Of course, all of us suffer. That's just part of the human condition. But some of us experience things that are particularly disruptive. I often use the analogy of a writer who's writing the story of their life and then has somebody sort of come and elbow them out of the way. Somebody, a big group of somebodies, an entire state elbowing them out of the way and starting to write on that page. And if you imagine that as your experience, what is the response inside of you? Could you just call it out? Loss of agency, fear, betrayal, anger, right? So a range of experiences. You might be thinking, how do I get that pen back? Or some of you might be thinking, again, depending on past experience, I'm never going to get that pen back. Might as well give up now. Yeah? It all has to do with the very unique combination of experiences somebody might have had before that will shape one's cognitive choices in a moment. Thank you very much for the time warning. All right. 3 kinds of stressors that accompany displacement usually takes place along 3 phases, some of which have already mentioned. The pre-migration stress, right? Exposure to censorship, armed conflict, violence, persecution, loss of records, livelihood, educational opportunities. Migration stress, which might involve complicated, sometimes life-threatening journeys involving violence, detention, limbo, the long experience of waiting. I've worked in many camps, and that would be the one thing people would tell me is the hardest, just the waiting. When can I get that pen back? right? My agency back to study, to work, to create. And then post-migration stress, characterized by that legal uncertainty, the ongoing waiting, and asylum decisions, healthcare, dental care, cultural supports. Again, that experience of waiting. The word post is really interesting here, and I think Robbie spoke about it, or somebody else did, that there sometimes isn't a post because you're living it, you're continuing to live it. But I also use that word post because sometimes when we think about post-traumatic stress, we think about the event as being the main traumatic event, as being the one that we wish we could have mitigated, we wish we could have stopped. But the post-event is actually really, really critical. Did people show up when you were in need? That can make an enormous difference around how somebody internalizes their worth in the world and their capacity to continue. Robbie spoke about this too in terms of the signal group. Who's accompanying you? Who's your go-to person, right? How do you know that you've got a system of support? How do you internalize that? I think about displacing experiences in my own life. And even if those people weren't there, I had what we call an imaginal social buffer, in the sense that I could call up internally the people who I knew had my back. And that makes a difference, makes a significant difference. It's not actually rocket science that way, isn't it? So when we think about mental health and psychosocial support, the UN's guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support give us a framework for how to respond. There is a pyramid that we've replicated in this book. This is called Creative Care, a resource for artists working in humanitarian contexts. Again, this is about how artists are responding to contexts of displacement, but there's a section in here which is also about those artists themselves being displaced, right? And so much of what I'm speaking to is just referenced here. So this pyramid is what I'm mentioning right now. It's online on the Jameel Arts and Health Lab website, and I have a few copies here if you'd like a hard copy. So layer one of that pyramid, basic services and security, of course 100% of people, this goes to mental health, but it also of course is combined with structural support. 100% of people who are displaced, whether by wildfires, floods, or war, will benefit from basic services, right? Safety, food, water, shelter, healthcare, legal protection, that's just foundational and true of all of us. The second layer, where we find about 30 to 75% of people experience this most acutely, so this is the majority, they will experience more moderate to severe distress. And for this group, the most effective intervention isn't clinical treatment, and often that clinical treatment, that highly specialized care, isn't available anyway, which necessitates more collective approaches, more social approaches that allow us to heal in public, that allow us to support each other in public. And a public meaning a safe enough space where we're able to build up the emotional architecture to be able to hear one another's stories and respond in a way that create a sense of emotional safety. So for this group, the effective intervention isn't necessarily specialized clinical treatment, it's strengthening community and family supports, activating social networks, collective cultural and religious practices, creating spaces where connection is possible. The biggest difference between toxic and tolerable stress The biggest difference between toxic and tolerable stress is the presence of supportive relationships and resources. If you think about your own capacity to get through very difficult experiences, I bet you could point to that. Which resources got you through, which people got you through, right? Layer 3 of that pyramid, this is where we might find about 15 to 20% of people who have experienced displacement. That 15 to 20% will experience symptoms of clinical depression or anxiety and benefit from more focused psychosocial support. And here, training non-specialists in psychological first aid and basic mental health support can be useful because, again, highly specialized care, we just do not have enough to go around. And then layer 4, there's specialized mental health services for which 3 to 4% will definitely benefit. For more severe conditions, psychiatric treatment, psychological therapy, and trauma-focused interventions that are culturally resonant. I'm going to just point this document out, which is a WHO policy brief that we put together a couple of years ago, which if you were to go to the Jameel Arts Health Lab site, you would find a brief that looks at a rapid review of what are artists doing in this space and what has been evidenced to work in theater, in film, in music, in dance, in literature, and how can we then mobilize that as part of a humanitarian response, whether that's on home soil or that's elsewhere. And you'll see a list of recommendations endorsed at that level and moved through sectoral governing convenings. So again, obviously not the only place where we are fighting this fight or advancing these kinds of ideas, but it's the area that I tend to work in. But I so appreciate the kinds of collective, structural, and solidarity-oriented strategies which take us out of an individual understanding of mental health to something that we need to attend to collectively and take responsibility for together. Thank you.